Welcome, welcome everybody. If you're just joining us, we have a few more people who are joining, and we will start in about half a minute. Welcome everybody. This is a discussion on NATO and the protection of civilians towards implementation. I'm Victoria Holt. I'm a vice president at the Stimson Center in Washington, and I'm delighted to kick off today's discussion. Stimson is a policy research institute, and we focus on many issues of international peace and security. This is particularly a conversation based out of our project, Strengthening NATO's Ability to Protect. So today is a report launch for two reports that we've done. One is on the origins, progress, and unfinished business of NATO's protection of civilians policy, and the other is a conference outcome from meetings we held at the end of last year. I would like to especially thank our colleagues at PAX and the government of the Netherlands for their support of this project. We'd also like to thank the members of our expert advisory group, professionals from a various set of backgrounds in the field, for offering their time and insights. And then in particular, I'd like to thank our colleagues across NATO who work every day to make this work. And some of them have been able to join us today. We hope that this research initiative supports their efforts. So in a minute, I'll turn to my colleagues, Katie Dock and Marla Keenan, who will brief on these two reports. But let me first, as moderator, sketch kind of the goals, but also take a moment to walk through what NATO's broad ambitions were with its protection of civilians policy. Some of you join us as deep experts in the field. For others, this may be the first conversation you've had about it. So why civilian protection? We know that civilians are often impacted by conflict, especially over the last 25 years, where they're purposely targeted and displaced. But we've also seen modern conflicts trend, the trends of modern conflict, where civilians are increasingly at the heart of those violent acts, whether they are proxy wars, conflicts with non-state actors. Many conflicts become internationalized, and there's increasing disregard for international humanitarian human rights law. This is further impacted by the rise of authoritarianism and challenges to democracy. So whatever way you look at, we know that NATO's future includes planning and supporting missions that will need to take civilian protection into account. So what does that mean? In 2016, the partners and allies drove the adoption of a really landmark protection of civilians policy. It set out a very positive vision. There's four main areas. One, working on facilitating access to basic needs. Two, contributing to a safe and secure environment. Three, understanding the human environment. And then fourth, which will be the primary subject for today's conversation, mitigating harm. That means mitigating harm from NATO's own operations, as well as, for the first time, acknowledging mitigating harm from other actors. So let me highlight briefly four other elements of this from the policy itself. So what are we talking about? Protection of civilians means persons, objects, and services, and taking efforts to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the negative effects that might arise from NATO and NATO-led military operations on the civilian population, and to protect civilians from conflict-related physical violence or threats of physical violence by other actors, including through the establishment of a safe and secure environment. So a big picture, but clear. The objectives include part of NATO's goals for long-term self-sustained peace, security, and stability, achieved in cooperation when possible with local authorities, population, civil society, and organizations working for human rights and gender equality, but always avoiding and minimizing and mitigating harm to civilians as an element of this approach. All right, next up, activities and tools. Activities identified included prevention, deterrence, preemption, and response to situations in which civilians suffer physical violence or are under threat. And in the toolkit, it acknowledged to integrate protection of civilians from the outset of NATO and NATO-led operations, including planning and conduct of operations and missions, training, education exercises, lessons learned, as well as defense and security capacity building activities. So a very broad concept and also very specific direction as to which tools this could be included in. So as I mentioned, this conversation will focus most on mitigating harm, in part because it comes directly from the policy, including civilian harm mitigation from its own actions. NATO allies and partners are obligated under international humanitarian law in all conflicts But in the planning and conduct of military operating missions, NATO wants to continue to take both measures to support that, but even go above and beyond in institutionalizing civilian harm mitigation measures based on its own lessons learned and best practices. And second, protecting civilians from the actions of others. A relatively new space, even as it's been aspirational and implicit in some and explicit in some past mission mandates. Militaries recognize threats to their own forces very easily, but it's often more difficult to recognize threats to the civilian population and understand how to weigh that in mission planning and as part of the objectives of operations. So the policy laid out, and we will talk a bit today about how to identify those threats, including the type of perpetrators, their motivation, strategies and tactics, capabilities, and the expected outcome for civilians, including through a gender-sensitive approach. So NATO planners at all levels could incorporate this in looking at military responses and options for NATO and NATO-led operations. It is ambitious. Anyone who read this in 2016 appreciated what NATO was taking on. And so I just want to emphasize again, our research project isn't support that ambition. So much important work has been done. Our ambition is to also set it in the context of what NATO is doing, looking forward. So on one hand, NATO has already tackled some of these issues. Certainly, its first Article 5 was triggered by a terrorist attack on civilians, for example. It's mitigated harm from others. We've seen this already. Kosovo, Bosnia, Libya, from ISIS and the Taliban. It's also mitigated harm from its own operations. We've seen this in Afghanistan in particular. So it's been an explicit and implicit goal. So again, I just want to situate this in the context of NATO looking forward. It's 2030 visioning. It's looking at its own strategic concept and the 5th anniversary of the protection of civilians policy itself, and maybe some role for that conversation leading up to the summit later this year. We also know that many governments support protection of civilians. So part of the conversation is what can they then do to help implement this policy that has this great vision? So let me turn now to my two fantastic Simpson colleagues. In a moment, I will turn to Katie Dock. She has written a report. It started as a simple exercise to interview a few people about the origins of this policy. And I think Katie, by the end, with our support, had interviewed over 30 people and also sent this around to a number of experts to understand if she has the narrative right about the origins of the policy and getting a sense of where it's been going. And second, I'll turn to Marla Keenan, who will review the policy itself and the expert ideas we heard during a workshop series in December that was really meant to be forward-looking. How does this fit in future mission sets, and what should NATO be considering based on the good work already done? So Katie is a research assistant with the Simpson Center. She previously was a Scoville Fellow and is a proud graduate of the University of California at Berkeley. Marla Keenan is probably known to many of you. She's a non-resident fellow with Simpson and also was a senior director of policy and advocacy at Civilians in Conflict, CIVIC. They have longer resumes you can find on our website. But with that, let me turn to you, Katie, to present your findings.
Thank you, Tori, for that really helpful introduction to the policy and overview. As Tori mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the findings from our recent report, Origins, Progress, and Unfinished Business, NATO's Protection of Civilians Policy. But first, I want to talk about why we did this research in the first place and why we think it's such an important story to tell. Initially, the goal of this research was to get an understanding of where the POC policy and implementation stood almost 5 years after its adoption. To do this, we first thought it was necessary to get a grasp on why this policy was adopted in the first place and how it came to be. As Tori mentioned, we thought this would be a pretty simple question, quick answer, but piecing together that story turned out to be much more complicated. There was no clear linear history that led to the policy's development. Instead, we found that the road to the policy was less one road than an intersection of many different roads at different times. So we started to piece together this story from various people's experiences, and as Tori noted, ended up conducting almost 30 interviews with stakeholders inside and outside of NATO, including representatives from NATO headquarters, Allied Command Operations, Allied Command Transformation, and experts from governments and NGOs. As we went through this process, the report became not so much an official history, but really a human narrative based on the experiences and thoughts of our interviewees. So I do want to take a quick moment to thank anyone here at this webinar who lent their time and expertise to these interviews, because this report really could not have come together without your invaluable contributions. So thank you. Now, turning to the origins of the policy, the following 4 factors were most commonly mentioned as contributing to the impetus for the policy. 1, momentum from lessons learned from NATO's mission in Afghanistan. 2, advocacy from civil society organizations and human rights groups to minimize civilian casualties. 3, a spillover effect from the UN and its member states increasing focus on protecting civilians. And 4, a push from a few allies, partners, and individuals who personally prioritized POC. I don't have time to go into all of these in depth right now, but I would be happy to expand on them during the Q&A if people are curious. I do want to note that virtually every single interviewee mentioned lessons learned from ISAF, NATO's mission in Afghanistan, as a driving force behind the policy. So I'll go into that a little bit. There was a recognition during ISAF that just following international humanitarian law was not doing enough to mitigate harm to civilians. We had one interview say to us, you can do a whole lot of wreckage to civilians, both short and long term, and still be technically compliant with the Geneva Conventions. And so there was this growing problem of coalition-caused civilian harm, which was not just a moral or legal issue. ISAF commanders on the ground began to identify civilian harm as fueling the growing insurgency. So protecting civilians was a strategic imperative. And I think that point is really important to emphasize as part of the origin of this policy, because POC so often gets thought of as just relevant to UN peacekeeping missions or as a soft issue, and it's not. It comes from hard requirements. And this was recognized initially. For example, the first Brussels-based section on protection of civilians in NATO was placed in the Operations Division in 2010, signaling that POC was seen at the time as a key operational issue. And once there was this impetus to create a policy spurred on by the 4 factors that I previously mentioned and formally pushed for by what was called a Tiger Team on Protection of Civilians, which was made up of 15 allied and partner nations, the policy was developed in less than a year to be ready for the 2016 Warsaw Summit. During the policy's development, there were a series of consultations with allies and outside experts on POC that contributed to how the policy was ultimately written. For example, several of these experts pushed the policy's developers to consider POC as more than just civilian harm mitigation and adherence to IHL, and to include physical protection from the harm of other actors as a critical part of the policy. And Tori mentioned this in her introductory remarks because we think this is one of the most unique and groundbreaking aspects of the policy. Mitigating harm does not just mean mitigating harm from NATO's own actions, but it can also include protecting civilians from harm caused by other actors. So since the policy's adoption in 2016, NATO has implemented an action plan, developed a military concept on POC, created a POC handbook, and integrated some POC inputs into NATO's Comprehensive Operations Planning Directive. These are all signs of significant progress within the alliance, but we really think that this work needs to continue so that the aspirations of the policy are fully realized. So to help this process, our research aimed to identify gaps or areas that needed further consideration in future implementation efforts, which I'm just going to give a quick rundown of those main points and findings. First, the formal lessons learned process. The policy states that NATO shall identify and implement lessons learned on protection of civilians in all relevant areas of operations and missions. But the majority of our interviewees felt that NATO lacks a systematic, consistent process through which to do so, noting that the current process through NATO's Joint Analysis Lessons Learned Center can be cumbersome and only works when specifically tasked what to look for. It was also unclear how lessons learned translate from one mission to another, or how identified lessons are then ingrained in future policy, training, or planning. So for example, while lessons learned from Afghanistan were pivotal in shaping the policy, no interviewee was aware of a similar process feeding into the policy's development from Operation Unified Protector in Libya, despite that mission's specific mandate to protect civilians. Second, training and education. NATO has made some really great progress in this area, including the NATO UN POC course at FinCENT and the inclusion of POC for the first time as an exercise objective in Steadfast Jupiter Jackal 2020. But POC is still consistently thought of as just a J9 civil military cooperation issue. So to have POC seen as relevant to the conduct of operations as a whole, which was the intention of the policy, POC needs to be a part of mandatory training and education for all branches of NATO. Third, there's a need to clarify allies and partners' national understandings of POC. Individual nations have their own approaches to POC, and it is often not defined or discussed in the same way across the alliance. So to develop a consistent and coherent approach to POC across the alliance, there's a need to understand what this different national guidance is and how it lines up with NATO's policy. One way NATO could do this is to task a mapping exercise to document NATO allies and partners' current guidance and capabilities on POC. Fourth, POC implementation is personality-based and experience-driven. Interviewees revealed that the integration of POC in operations is highly dependent on if planners personally prioritize POC or have previous experience with POC-related missions. This dependence on personal experience shows that POC has not yet been inculcated or mainstreamed across the operational branches. Finally, POC is not as widely discussed within NATO as it was when the policy was adopted. POC was moved out of the operations division and now falls under NATO's human security unit with other really important cross-cutting topics like women, peace and security, and children in armed conflict. But many interviews expressed some concern about this shift to the human security framework because NATO does not currently have an official definition of the term, and human security is pretty broad, notably much broader than POC. So NATO needs to define what human security means for NATO as a military organization and clarify how POC fits into that framework. I'm going to leave it there for now and turn to my colleague Marla Keenan to discuss the readout from our 2020 expert workshop and some of our more concrete recommendations. Thanks so much.
Wow, thanks, Katie. That was incredible, and I will endeavor to follow up on the great place where you started. So good morning, and thank you for joining us for this really important and timely discussion, I think, especially since 2021 is such an important year for POC at NATO. I'd like to start by thanking all those who participated in our work, both Katie's and then also the workshops that we held in December. We hope that we've done a good job in representing the depth and the breadth of the views that we collected during our work last year. So I'm going to jump right in here because there's quite a lot. In December 2020, we held this series of workshops to really explore the implementation status of NATO's 2016 policy on the protection of civilians. And we wanted to identify research areas in this field, both that had been done and that needed to be done in the future, and to also consider how future conflict scenarios may need to take into account harm to civilians. And the workshops brought together more than 100 practitioners, academics, and representatives of militaries and governments, as well as some of our interlocutors at NATO. So we had quite a broad and diverse group of people. So many of the findings in Katie's research that she just spoke about were validated and actually built upon in the workshops. And so before I dive into recommendations, I want to spend just a few minutes kind of talking about what I consider to be the top 4 findings across the board, both through the research and what we found in the workshops. So the first one is violence against civilians is unlikely to decline in future warfare. And this is going to impact how NATO trains for and plans for all of their future operations. So given the trends in conflict that we're all seeing, including an increase in proxy wars and non-state actors, violations of international humanitarian law, direct attacks on civilians as a tactic, participants noted that the importance of recognizing this, and this particularly with an eye toward future operations, we'll need to consider that conflict often extends into and sometimes begins with civilians and civilian areas. So in some cases, civilians themselves are targets. So there are additional challenges I think that we're all aware of, such as cyber warfare and disinformation campaigns. These affect civilians in completely different ways, but are likewise a threat to peace and security across the alliance and the partners. NATO has made much progress in implementing its POC policy. Katie and Tori both mentioned this, and I think this is absolutely true. But there's more work to be done. And the continuation of the implementation process is really important if we want to realize the true aspiration outlined in that 2016 policy. And I'll give you one example, one of my favorite examples from Afghanistan. So some of you may have heard of the Civilian Casualty Tracking Cell, which eventually became the Civilian Casualty Mitigation Team. That was one of the most effective tools in that conflict to help commanders really understand the impact they were having on the civilian population. Yet that lesson did not automatically translate even to Libya, as those two conflicts were running concurrently. It's not captured in any sort of standard operating procedure that I'm aware of. So in each conflict, each commander is sort of left to recreate the wheel. And that's the work that needs to be done now, is to really capture those operational and tactical lessons learned. So while NATO has made much progress in understanding how to protect civilians from its own actions particularly, and that's of course through adherence to IHL and civilian harm mitigation measures, it should capture these measures in SOPs. That's incredibly important. But beyond that, there's still more work to do to develop a greater understanding and clarity in how to protect civilians from the harm that is committed by other belligerents. So not NATO, but those who may seek to harm civilians, either because they're just sort of don't care if they do harm civilians, or as a specific tactic. And so POC is a core military capability, right? And it's under the larger human security umbrella at NATO, but it needs to be developed just like any other military capability does. So for example, we don't expect our artillery units to just show up in the battle space and figure out how to use artillery and how to do it effectively. Neither should we expect that from soldiers as we're asking them to do protection of civilians. We have to develop the tactics, techniques, and procedures and train every NATO soldier. As an example of something that would need to be developed, the workshop participants, many of them noted that threat assessment and planning tools are incredibly important in protecting civilians. And they need to consider threats facing civilians in these future mission areas. So NATO has embraced threat assessment as a key sort of point in protection of civilians. And it's trained in some places, for example, including the FinCENT course that Katie mentioned earlier. But how are we training our J2 staff? Are we training our J2 staff on this? How are we training the J3 and the J5? So intelligence and planning and operations, all of those need to be involved in POC training, not just the J9. So a renewed political focus on POC is also necessary. So POC at NATO had enjoyed quite strong support and attention in the run-up to the 2016 summit, and in the adoption of the policy and the action plan that resulted. NATO allies and partners need to re-up on this, and they need to signal political will in support of the implementation, including establishing a new action plan. So there was an action plan that governed the first 4, I believe, years of the implementation, but that action plan has sort of expired, and there's a new one that's necessary because there's more work that needs to be done. And in order to do this, of course, it would be great to have dedicated human and financial resources. So now I want to move on a little bit to some specific recommendations. So from the wealth of ideas from the workshop, I tried to pull out here just a few that I think are really important and high level enough that they're not sort of in the weeds, but that they're sort of the ones that frame the work that could go on in the future. I highly recommend that you read the reports just so that you can see sort of all of the various recommendations that we created. So allies and partners should work together to design a more intentional and precise POC roadmap to operationalize the policy and support its implementation. So some participants noted that there were few POC discussions at NATO today, but that POC should be seen as a critical part of their future priorities. And there is interest in and demand for information about POC within the offices of many permanent representatives. And so it's really important that we start sort of like agitating again and getting that information out and talking about why it's important to continue to make progress, especially in light of what future operations for NATO may look like. And this work, of course, should include what I mentioned earlier, which is developing a new action plan. A new 3 to 5 year action plan could really go a long way to allowing NATO to do additional implementation work that will create better capabilities for future NATO missions. We should include a robust discussion of the importance of POC to future missions in the forthcoming strategic concept. So some of you may be aware that NATO has been going through the process of NATO 2030. They're working on the new strategic concept now. There's a summit and hopefully coming up here in the summer. I haven't heard the exact dates, but our interlocutors found that POC would absolutely be directly relevant to future missions of NATO, and the strategic concept addresses what future missions might look like at NATO, and therefore it should be discussed as, again, a core military capability. The summit and of course the strategic concept seem perfect places to do this and to really reaffirm the importance of protection of civilians for NATO. So we need to rebuild and sustain political attention on POC. One way to do this might be for interested allies and partners to opt into affinity groups, such as a group of friends for the protection of civilians. This could provide a loose but helpful structure for allies to establish discussions, move their work forward, and revitalize other allies and partners' interests in support of these political efforts. And then really emphasize POC across the key military directorates, including intelligence, operations, planning, communications, and civilian military cooperation. POC is not just a J9 function. Almost all military functions can and should play an incredibly important role in effective POC to make this work operationally. So for example, as mentioned before, to protect civilians, NATO should include analysis of specific threats, perpetrators for its missions. This may require developing protocols to conduct better assessments and to support operational planning. Those things don't happen necessarily in the J9, they happen in the J2, the 3, and the 5. So, having a more systematic way to look at protection of civilians across all of the military functions, we believe is very important. Participants also recommended requiring systematic and specialized training on POC for military staff involved in NATO operations as part of mandatory training across the various J roles. And this training, again, would include things like the threats-based approach and threat assessment. This, while there is a week-long NATO POC training that was developed and deployed by FinCENT, which is fantastic. I have participated in it and worked on it from the early days. It's a great starting point, but it's a small group of people that are coming to it now, and it really needs to be much more broad and specialized for the various function. So in closing, I just want to urge us all to action. You're here for a reason today. You care about NATO, you care about protection of civilians. The time for this work is right now. This year marks the 5th anniversary of the policy. NATO is in the midst of NATO 2030 and the revision of the strategic concept. There is a summit this year and a new action plan is needed, just to name a few of the opportunities. So I've touched on some of the high-level recommendations here. We go quite deep in the report, so I urge you to take a look. We've specifically kept the reports short and pithy because we know you are all very busy. So please, if you do have a chance, take a look at these reports. And again, just thank you for being here today, and we're looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Marla. Thank you, Katie. And I appreciate we were already seeing some good questions and answers, which we'll turn to in a minute in the chat. But first we have 2 commentators. So let me turn first to Stephen Hill. Stephen, welcome. You have spent part of your career as a legal advisor and also with NATO. So we appreciate you joining us today. And this is really meant to be a conversation. So all your thoughts are welcome. I think you may be muted.
Tori, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I want to really send big congratulations out to Marla and Katie for the work that they've been able to do, not only in this event, but in these reports. You're absolutely right, Marla, that they are pithy. They are not in the weeds, and they make recommendations that I can say, as someone who's spent 6 years now working as the chief legal advisor to the NATO international staff, they're very much in the NATO spirit. So those of you who are NATO either officials or aficionados, I would highly recommend this report as something that is truly news you can use. I think it's also an excellent initiative because it rightly acknowledges and I would say commends the legacy and the leadership that NATO has been able to show in this space. And I think that that is very much absolutely of a piece of the leading role that NATO should take as an alliance of values. We also need to remember that NATO is a force for the protection of civilians. It's often, as Tori pointed out in her introduction, civilians are targeted, and these are, it's often NATO that can help create a safe and secure environment that will help reduce those kind of actions. And I'm thinking of situations around the world, not just Afghanistan. So I was reflecting today on how NATO has successfully employed the tools that it has to implement policies. And this has happened in a lot of areas. We know that NATO frequently is confronted with new threats, new kind of situations. I'm thinking of NATO's work in the cyber domain, for example, that started back in the even in the 90s and in the 2000s. I'm thinking of the journey that NATO has started in recent years in the space policy area. It'll often start with a broad declarative policy, and then it moves down the hierarchical ladder of documentation, and we see this happening in the POC space. And I think that process should be encouraged. One area that I see that has been really important in the cyber arena, and I think it's going to be important in the space arena, is the use of NATO's capabilities, development, capabilities planning, capabilities targeting practices in order to build a kind of data-driven and accountable system that is designed to actually implement the policy. So for example, in cyber, NATO developed cyber capability targets for allies, and then it had this thing called the Cyber Defense Pledge, which was a voluntary pledge that had a reporting requirement to it. And I think you point to this in your recommendations because you talk about the need to develop training, you talk about the possible interest of reporting, but I wanted to see if I could engage you on, what kind of data is out there that NATO could usefully use to as possible places where allies could build a kind of reporting and even capabilities planning system. What kind of actual benchmarks do you think might be useful to try to take this wonderful legacy that NATO has and take it to the next level? So let me sort of put that out on the table, because I think that would be using a lot of the policy making and implementation tools that NATO has been very successful with over the years to try to drive this forward. Of course, in addition to the various other areas that are key NATO strengths, like training, like capacity building advice, and the other things that you point out in the report. So kudos, and I hand it back to you, Tori.
Thanks, Stephen. You're always wonderfully thought-provoking, and we really appreciate your commentary and advice to us. We have one other commentator. Larry Lewis is with us today. Larry, from the Center for Naval Analysis.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. We welcome your questions and thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I thought Stephen describing POC within NATO as a journey was a really apt way to think about it. So I think of what Simpson is doing, kind of looking at this journey after 5 years, and kind of getting out your phone, looking at Google Maps and seeing where you are versus where you want to be, and doing a course correction is a really valuable exercise. So I just have a few thoughts kind of based on that that valuable exercise. So first of all, I think the attention on protection from others is a really useful element in this NATO protection of civilians approach. We've seen historically there have been moments of great creativity in this area, and including some offensive actions that I think Charlie Dunlap would like a lot. But those moments really weren't sustained in a systematic way. So I welcome kind of more attention, because so much more can be done than what has been done to date. But I do want to make one comment on civilian harm mitigation, so CHM. So two statements from the two reports. One is that NATO has made much progress in understanding how to protect civilians from a CHM context. And then there's another statement in another report that says NATO went beyond measures taken by ISAF. And so I think I see the NATO POC policy and the concept are great aspirations, but I think there's a big gulf between those aspirations and the reality on the ground even today. So, for example, Operation Resolute Support, a NATO operation, has had an escalating level of international force caused civilian harm. Now, last year was kind of a difference, but for the years leading up to that, we saw the numbers go up and up and up, and not only the numbers, but the rate of civilian harm was also going up, meaning that operations were becoming increasingly riskier to civilians over time. I think that is perhaps a symptom of something that is easy to see happen in a NATO context, that CHM refers to kind of procedures and at the tactical and operational level for individual attacks. And that's really kind of the main purpose of main approach of CHM, but much more is possible. So NATO still has a lot of work that it can learn in how to implement CHM at the campaign level, right? How to monitor and adapt to address areas of risk to civilians at the strategic and operational levels. And that's something that ISAF got pretty good at, but really haven't seen in Resolute Support. So, so per Marla's comment that there's much more to be done, I agree. And I'd love to see NATO think about this, right? Think about, okay, what has NATO just done, and what could be done better to more truly approach the goals of this POC policy.
Thank you very much, Larry. We appreciate your giving us some insights and provocation to discuss those questions. So let me do this. I see some fantastic Q&As appearing in the chat, and I want to recognize in particular Charlie Dunlap has given us not only terrific questions, but reading, which I unfortunately won't be able to do in the moment, but we would like to answer those questions that he's putting forth. And we will do so in a minute. But let me first turn to Marla and Katie for some initial responses from the comments of Stephen and Larry, and then I will turn to some of the Q&A that is coming up for a second round. Marla, do you want to start with first?
Yeah, I mean, I just, I don't have much to say other than that I agree with all of that. I think, one important point that Larry specifically made is that kind of what I said as well is there has been progress to the level that it's been institutionalized. That's the issue, right? So we don't, if we make progress, but we don't institutionalize those lessons, meaning, for example, the CCMT, it didn't even translate from Afghanistan to Libya at the same time that those two things were going on. So making sure that we capture those so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, to me, is part of the next level of this work.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in on a little response to Stephen's questions about kind of what kind of data is out there or what kind of benchmarks, what steps can NATO take in that direction to take this to the next level. And I think one of the things that we've identified and talked about is, getting a greater understanding of what its own allies and partners' capabilities are. Because like I said, different allies and different partners have different approaches to POC, and some are more advanced than others, some have different perspectives on it. And I think that, using the fact that there is an alliance with all these different wealth of information and trying to figure out who does what and what capabilities are out there, and trying to synchronize those, or at least bring the policy in line with them, or bring them in line with the policy, would be a really useful next step, as well as kind of greater information sharing with NATO and with allies and with civil society that works on this. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. I'm turning it to the Q&A, and there's a range of questions in there, including some about the operational capabilities. One question relates to future planning, and part of our project is actually commissioning papers to explore in depth some of these issues. So I will tell you now, if there's an area of research that either you yourself are conducting or you would like to see conducted, we will save everything in the Q&A for the future conversations. Briefly, there is one of our papers is looking specifically at how you could better enhance threat assessments and the perpetrator motives by some scholars and analysts from Norway, which we hope to publish later this year. And they're very focused on how to actually operationalize those threat assessments. Some of the questions I see in the chat get to policy decisions. And as you can hear from what we're saying, in great part, that would be left in the hands of the policymakers and the decision makers. Much of our emphasis is lining up, understanding the threat environment, both to NATO itself, to the civilians you're trying to protect, and to the larger strategic aims of the mission. It's not ourselves making a recommendation one way or the other, but just trying to grapple with what at the strategic, tactical, and operational level planners would anticipate and plan for. So that's a broad answer. There's also a question in here regarding the relationship to the United Nations. I think Marla already mentioned that there's been some very direct and purposeful engagement, including a training course. I'm not an expert on all of that, but it does seem to be an area where there's been some very fruitful engagement and discussion. Much of the UN's own work has focused primarily on UN-led missions, which peace operations, broadly speaking, operate with consent of the parties. And while they'll see operational and tactical challenges and violence against civilians, it's usually in that context. Or they're authorizing operations by others, inclusive of NATO, and there the strategic aim may be to use force to deter, prevent, and if necessary, coerce perpetrators. So we're also happy to take that one on later. But Marla, Katie, looking at these questions in the chat, there's a good one regarding both the relationship with children in armed conflict and how POC fits along, Marla, that you might want to think about, and also another question related to women, peace, and security. You're also familiar with how the lessons learned that came out of Afghanistan could be actually applied today to future planning. So I don't know if I could ask you to take a look at either of those. And then also, I'm trying to read here. Katie, I think one of the points you raised in your review was the case of Libya. And maybe you could say a little bit more about how we found the experience of the planners for the Libya mission and why that came to one of your conclusions that was a bit personality driven. And while you do that, I will go back to the Q&A and pull a few more up. Over to you, Marla.
Okay. Well, I see a bunch of questions in here from Charlie Dunlap. Thank you so much. And anything that we don't answer here, we will follow up with, because there are many really fascinating questions in here. So we're going to try to get to as many as we can. So, Tori and I often talk about, to one of your questions, inaction in war. Like, what is the issue? What is the issue when we're actually not using force or refuse to use force in order to protect civilians? And that is why we think it's really important that that protection from other actors is included in that policy, because it gives NATO the opportunity to then develop capabilities specifically in that space. And then grappling with the problem of human shields, I think kind of goes along hand in hand in sort of new tactics that people or that groups are using. It's not specifically a new tactic as in the last few years, but new tactic in the last 20 years. And it's absolutely a problem. I think a lot of work has been done to try and figure out in the civilian harm mitigation space, like how do we do that? How do we work around those issues? But for sure, it's a problem. And I think actually that might be a really interesting research project, because I haven't seen a lot of research out there. So as Tori mentioned, we're looking into Article 5 and how protection of civilians would necessarily play out in a NATO Article 5, in area Article 5 operation. So trying to understand what the additional capabilities are needed, how NATO would then work with a host nation government that was one of the allies or partners. So future research on that as well. Tori, was there a question on children in armed conflict? Was that the other one?
Yes, I think both for that and women, peace, security, the relationship to the POC work.
Yeah, so there are separate tracks at NATO for children in armed conflict and also women, peace, and security. Women, peace, and security at NATO is very strong. They've done quite a lot of really good work in that space, as well as children in armed conflict. So I think the way that NATO views it is that there's a human security umbrella, right? And again, needs a little work to define that. But then underneath that umbrella is children in armed conflict, protection of civilians, women, peace, and security. So each of those kind of has a separate strand. And unfortunately, I'm not an expert in either of those two topics, but there is work that's being done. And again, it's sort of in parallel lines to protection of civilians.
Thanks, Marla. Katie?
Yeah, so on your question about the planning of Libya and kind of what we found out about that. So, you know, when we were talking to people about the planning process, and because Operation Unified Protector did have that specific Security Council mandate to protect civilians, we were really curious when talking to planners about how was that translated then into operational guidance, and how did it become part of the plans? And we did have somebody very frankly tell us, you know, the capabilities weren't necessarily laid out for us on what that means operationally. And it came down to the fact that one of the lead operational planners had past experience in the Balkans, and had an understanding of protection of civilians, and personally chose to prioritize civilians. And this interviewee said to us, you know, if another person had been in charge, we would have seen a very different execution of the mission, one that likely was not based on the protection of civilians. So, you know, this is where we came to this conclusion that it was very personality based, and that protection of civilians is not yet, you know, part of this greater toolbook for planners, where they can just, you know, look through what are all the things they need to consider, you know, okay, need to consider this operation through the lens of protection of civilians. That's the aspiration, but it doesn't seem like they're quite there yet.
Thank you, Katie. Marla, I'm going to turn to the Q&A and ask you some big questions that are coming up here. One is from our colleague Ian Anthony. As NATO places more emphasis on Article 5 tasks, does the POC task change? And I know that's something you've put some thought into. And then related to this, there are some questions from a range of people, but one from let me merge two people, but basically saying, in an era of great power competition, is POC actually a constraint on NATO? Will this actually reduce its ability to use force effectively to achieve its aims if it is worried about protection of civilians from the harm of NATO's own operations? And I will note there's been some work looking at that. So often a criticism of protection of civilians is that harm mitigation is something that Western governments adopt, but that perhaps is a disadvantage in the field. And I'll turn to you to answer that. But while you're thinking about it, I'll just note it did come up in our workshop. And one of the areas that I think also the report to the Secretary General of NATO said is that NATO is a political alliance and a values-based alliance. And I think in our view, protection of civilians is part of that value set. And that almost all the allies and partners of NATO broadly embrace not just international humanitarian human rights law, but the broader concept of protecting their own populations from harm as a sovereign goal, but also the aspiration for all civilians. So I think there's a moral aspect, but maybe Marla, I can turn to you on that more operational question, both for NATO's future in Article 5, but also is this actually a constraint on future operations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think POC looks different in every type of conflict, right? But what stays the same is the set of tactics that can be used, right? So in an Article 5, in area Article 5, for example, where maybe one of our partners is being attacked, or they're having part of their sovereign territory taken away, I think it's incredibly important, because again, you're in a situation like that, you're not just thinking about defeating an enemy. You're thinking about what happens afterwards and how to maintain peace and security for the long run. So protecting the civilians within your space, like, of course, not doing understanding that, you know, civilians may be in the other space that they've taken over too. So not causing damage there, protecting from your operations, but also protecting civilians from the operations from the other side, I think is incredibly important. And it may actually even be more important than an operation that happens outside of NATO, you know, ally and partner borders. So I actually think it does change, but the need for it does not change. And I've heard quite a lot of arguments over the last, you know, 15 years of doing this work that, like, oh, if it's country on country or near peer, all of this goes out the window. I would actually argue that people should be a little bit more thoughtful in making that argument, only because I think it shifts the dynamics so much that the population does actually become very important in defeating the other side, right? So there's quite a few organizations that are doing really interesting research into great power competition and to large scale combat operations and what this might look like. And as we have our list of sort of research projects, there's a research project that we're interested in working with another organization. Center for Civilians in Conflict is working quite deeply in this area. So again, not to duplicate, just that information is very important for allies, and it's very important for NATO, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Marla. So some of the questions in the chat that are coming up, one here says, protection of civilians should always be an active, even proactive goal of any intervention, rather than simply a prevention of harm to civilians in times of war. What is NATO doing to actively protect civilians in the theaters of operations? So I will note that part of our research is trying to answer that question, particularly in the case of Ukraine. But Katie, briefly, did you find much talking about how that concept was operating in the lead up to the writing of the policy? You mentioned Afghanistan. Is that the primary case you found? And then Marla, there's a question here about how we repeatedly have to establish and acknowledge the understanding of why protection of civilians needs to be addressed as equally important to traditional use of force in pursuit of national security. Could you dwell for a moment on the aspect of the strategic importance of taking POC into account beyond the moral and legal aspects? I think you actually did just touch on that a bit, more in the context of limiting NATO. But the question goes on to say, the risk of undermining legitimacy by not being able to protect could perhaps be a factor that might be worth mentioning, at least to the broader audience. Mm-hmm. And then if you want to also touch another question, if we have any examples of how protection of civilians is applied within NATO's member states' borders. And so I'll turn to you in a second, Katie. Just apologies to our audience. There's so many fantastic questions here. If I'm skipping you, it is completely by accident and wish we had more time. Over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Tori. Yeah, there are really just an overwhelming amount of excellent questions in the chat, which is great. So yeah, I mean, the premise of this question that protection of civilians should always be an active, even proactive goal of any intervention. I couldn't agree with more. And I think that the NATO policy does set to put that forward as a goal, and says that especially in the part of mitigating harm that we've discussed, that is not only mitigating the harm of NATO's own actions, but also preventing harm to civilians from other actors. I think that's where the kind of proactive and active prevention starts to come in. But in the development of the policy, the original impetus of the policy, I think that wasn't as heavily considered. I think it definitely mostly came from lessons learned from ISAF, as I mentioned, which were very centered on civilian harm mitigation. In terms of other missions. I mean, Libya, we couldn't find as many examples of that feeding into the policy. It doesn't mean it wasn't done or there weren't reviews of that done, just not publicly available. And in terms of, I'm not an expert on NATO's current theaters of operations, but I think the policy, this is the aspiration, is to implement this. And so I think this is a part of the policy that needs to be further emphasized.
Thanks, Katie. Marla?
Yeah, well, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to keep this short. But on the strategic importance question, I just want to give a little bit of an example. We're working on creating a scenario-based training where it's an Article 5 operation within a partner state, and another state comes into their space and basically is beginning to harm civilians as they're trying to flee. And I think many of us recognize this scenario from Mosul and Raqqa. So I think the importance there is basically saying, if there's an expectation of civilians that when a group like NATO or even the UN comes in, there will be protection, right? And so in this scenario, there's a situation where, NATO, as they're going against the quote unquote bad guys, they harm civilians in the process. And then a few days later, the bad guys start harming civilians as NATO is just sitting in their areas, right? And then the mayor issues a press release, as we've seen in lots of other conflicts as well, saying, NATO, what are you doing? Like, you're here to protect, you're harming our civilians, you're here to protect, you're not protecting our civilians. Like, what are you doing? That is 100% highly likely to happen if we can't get a way to provide the protection that is expected. A lot of people will argue that, oh, well, if it's not mandated, it doesn't need to be done. But I would argue that the strategic consideration for how damaging it can be when there's an expectation from the civilian population for protection is probably one of the most challenging things to overcome if you don't get ahead of it. So the second thing is, what does POC in a NATO member state look like? That's a really incredibly interesting question because, as you know, in any state, the responsibility to protect their own civilians is their responsibility. When you then have a force like NATO coming in, especially in a partner and an ally, there has to be a very serious discussion about whose responsibility is what. If the government needs support from NATO to do protection, they need to be very clear about what is required and what is not required, right? So that communication and that planning is really important. And that's why it's really important for NATO allies and partners to have a clear understanding of what the protection of civilians policy is and to have their own policy so that they integrate, right? We talk about NATO integration all the time. There needs to be a clear understanding across all the allies and partners so that everybody shows up on the same page, ready to get started.
Thanks, Marla.
Yep.
Just a few additional points, perhaps. This is a hard concept in one aspect, which is most Western militaries are trained to protect homelands or geography in national interest. So the idea of protecting civilians is a new way and adds some aspect of thinking as not just the outcome of what you do, but with something you may be literally responding to direct physical violence. So some of the questions in the chat talk about the UN. And while our project is focused on NATO, one thing we've seen the United Nations do is recenter the way you think about protection of civilians within their area of operation and area of responsibility, because it developed its own concept. So some of that has helped, inclusive of governments that are part of NATO, understand in that context how to assess threats to civilians, how to understand what are tactical and localized problems like mob violence, what could escalate to extreme ethnic cleansing or regime crackdown, or even in a most extreme, genocide. And by analyzing the nature of the threats, you also can analyze whether it's a tactical localized problem, a larger operational issue that any mission will face, even as it may have larger strategic objectives, or if it becomes a strategic problem for your mission. So again, a lot of our goal is to help NATO recognize the ambition it has and to reflect back the tools that may already exist. Some of you have asked about the expert community. We have begun to put one together. If you're interested, get in touch with us. We're beginning to commission some papers because we think that this work is so important. Let me also briefly highlight A few things that both Katie and Marla pointed to. I've just mentioned again the importance of threat assessment. There are tools out there. So for those of you asking questions, we'd be happy to get in touch. Again, we're commissioning papers in this area. Also, some of our authors are looking at the future set of NATO. Stephen talked about cyber. That is absolutely on the table. Many of you have talked about women, peace, security, children armed conflict. All of these are part of it. So we're trying to look and see how those integrate. But as Katie mentioned, and Marla mentioned, there's no current map of what NATO's allies and partners understand at their own national level as to how and what the expectations are to engage with NATO and protection of civilians for future planning, whether they be police, military, civilians, or political leaders. So we think that kind of mapping has begun. At least one member state has commissioned its own work to look at how its own national capabilities link with NATO's goals. That could be a model for the future. You can get in touch with us if you want. We can talk about that. But also, I want to give a shout out to the people who work in NATO. They are an unbelievable group of people. They're too small, in my opinion. They've got a huge task ahead of them, and they need human and political support as well as material resources to get the work done. So in a sense, I apologize for raising ambition, but I don't apologize really, because it is the right ambition. And for a values-based alliance like NATO, it is the right way to go, and is a strategic competitive advantage that it will hold over those it's in competition with, if not direct conflict with. So I hate to call this to an end, but I want to respect everybody's time. We're going to save everything in the Q&A. Please get in touch with us. We have a website. Any of us would be happy to speak to you. We welcome your engagement, your criticisms, your questions, your invitations. And again, thank you to Katie Dock, Marla Keenan, and our commentators, Stephen Hill and Larry Lewis, and also to PAX and the Government of Netherlands for their support. And with that, I will close this session. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for coming.